Welcome to the Foreign Service Institute's Mabini Dialogue. My name is Uriel and I will be your MC for this afternoon. This afternoon we are privileged to have with us Ambassador James Moran, Associate Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International European Policy Studies in Brussels, to deliver a lecture on the discord between EU and the US, fallout for ASEAN and the Philippines. Ambassador James Moran was a principal advisor on the Middle East and North Africa at the EU's External Action Service in Brussels in 2016-2017. His long service with the European institutions was spent entirely in external relations and includes wide experience in European foreign, security, trade, and development policy in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. From 2012 to 2016, he was EU ambassador and head of the European Union delegation in the Arab Republic of Egypt, and from 1999 to 2002, was EU ambassador to Jordan and Yemen. Ambassador Moran was also the EU senior coordinator in Libya during the 2011 revolution. Prior to joining the EU in 1983, he worked for the UK government and private sector in London. A UK national, he attended Kiel, Harvard, and London universities. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give a warm round of applause to Ambassador James Moran.
Thank you for the introduction, Ariel, which was very kind. One thing you didn't mention was that, and part of the reason why I'm here in the Philippines, was that I did spend quite a bit of my time on Asian affairs, where I was the Asia director in what was then the European Commission's Relics Department for some years. And what brings me back to the Philippines, apart from meeting all of you today, is the EU-Philippines Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which is now ratified by the Philippines and is now getting underway. And we had a very good conference yesterday when I was very pleased to make contact again with colleagues like Enrique Manalo, Ambassador Manalo, who was the negotiator on the Philippine side. I was the negotiator on the European side for that agreement. And it's really good to be back in the Philippines and to see how things have moved on here, how things have changed in the last 10 years. Because in the interim, as Oriol mentions, I spent my time in another part of the world, the Middle East, which is a long way from here, but also shares some of the challenges that you have in the Philippines. And I want to touch on some of those as we talk about the subject today. Well, the title of what I'm going to talk about, you can see, a lot of people are concerned at the moment about the different disorder that we see in the international system. And it is true that there are many, many disagreements, and we'd better have a look at some of these and see what consequences they have in this part of the world. But let me declare my hand at the beginning. I'm someone who has spent most of his working life on the European idea and project, but having studied there, some of my best friends are Americans, and I know that without the visionary generation of American leaders after the Second World War, there probably would not be a European Union today. Part of the history, recent history of Europe and the European Union is intimately associated with a constructive American approach to the international order. So I want to say that at the outset, because I'm not going to be terribly complimentary about what US policy is right now. Now, last month, Donald Trump, talking about trade wars, which is a favorite subject of his, blustered that he thinks that of the EU as a foe, as an enemy, on account of its trade policies. Now, even by Mr. Trump's standards, this was an extraordinary remark to make about America's closest and oldest ally. Another, but rather less well-known Donald, and here I refer to Donald Tusk, who is the president of the European Council, tweeted back to Mr. Trump, with a little bit of irony, saying that America and the EU are best friends. Whoever says we are foes is spreading fake news. And that hints at a nuance in EU-US relations which we often forget. And that is that relations are not always just about the principles, the people at the top. But they are, like any mature relationship, complex and multi-layered, and I'll come back to some of that along the way as I speak to you now. But that said, since the election of Mr. Trump, there have been a series of developments that, on the face of it, give real cause for concern about the state of transatlantic relations, and many, of course, lamenting that, others perhaps celebrating it as what they perceive as a decline in the Western world. And these developments have consequences for other parts of the world, including right here in the Philippines. And again, a bit more of that later on. Let's take a look at some of the more serious disputes that we have at the moment. Firstly, a subject which I know is close to your hearts here, both politically and in many other ways, and that is the climate change. Now here there is a very clear parting of the ways between Europe and the US. The Trump administration, of course, has signaled a pullout from the UN Climate Convention, and the EU continues to defend it tooth and nail, in the belief that for all its shortcomings, it's the best way to ensure that countries live up to their commitments on emissions reduction for the good of us all. And I see you're doing something about it here in the Philippines as well. I was hearing about your plans to reduce pollution here in Manila and in many other places. Now, the European Union has not yet given up entirely on the US, and declared earlier this year that there is, and I'm quoting here, a need to continue to strengthen political outreach and public diplomacy up to the highest official levels. And this implies continued efforts to persuade the Trump administration to change direction on some of these issues. And the leaders from the EU never fail to make this point when dealing with the Americans. But it must be said that the prospects of success, at least in Washington, are pretty dim, as long as this administration is in power. Recent moves by the US Environmental Protection Agency to dismantle regulations added to the sort of rhetoric on display that we heard from Mr. Trump visiting the coal mines in West Virginia a couple of weeks ago. These show that the Americans are probably not listening to what the Europeans are telling them. I suppose the hope in Europe is that since the actual pullout from the convention can't take place until November 2020, which is just after the next US presidential election, there will, so to speak, be regime change in the meantime that might allow for a change of course. But it's no more than that, it's only a hope. And at the same time, and here I go back to some of those nuances I was talking about earlier, there are many US state administrations, I'm sure you know, notably California, but others too, that basically see eye to eye with the climate convention and indeed with the European position, and are getting on with their own climate control measures, which given the size of these economies will make a difference. So it's not just about Trump and the people around him. And that's just as well, because the effects are surely evident everywhere now. Not least here, which is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, where you've experienced ever more frequent bouts of extreme weather and the disasters that accompany it. And of course, we know something about it on the European side. We have contributed from the EU and indeed from European countries to some of the humanitarian operations that you've had here after the typhoons. I'm sure you're aware of that. And the Philippines is one of the countries, I think, that has been most concerned about the effects of climate change. And so it's not just the Philippines and the ASEAN area, there are other countries here too, but this country is probably the island that is right in the stream in the ASEAN countries context of climate change and its effects. So it's good that we're cooperating on this, and also on renewable energy and efficiency, although I know a lot more probably needs to be done. And there's another thing which I think we have to admit. Without the US fully on board, after all, it remains the world's second largest emitter, and it is what it is, an extremely influential country. Without them on board, fighting climate change will be an even greater struggle than it is already. And I don't think we can expect China to, even though it may be committed to the convention, or at least has made that statement, we cannot expect China or anybody else to step up to the plate to take the strain. The Europeans will certainly do what they can. I'm sure the same applies here in ASEAN and in the Philippines. But without the Americans, it's going to be a real battle in the next generation to make a difference on climate change. So we have a real problem here, and we have a fundamental disagreement with the United States on the European side, with no solution in sight. Second point is on trade. Now, when I joined the European Commission back in the early 1980s, I was very happy to come to Brussels to join the European project, but I did have a slight hesitation. Because back then, I thought I might be working for an outfit that was essentially a protectionist outfit. The EEC, as it then was, and there was somebody in the room here, the former director of the EEC, Mr. Eric Muller, who's joined us today, who knows better than me because he joined 10 years before I did. I'll be interested to see if he would agree with me. But I had the feeling that it was a protectionist outfit, and I didn't like the idea of trade protectionism. But on the other hand, there were lots of positives about working for the what became the EU in Brussels. The result, that was mainly the result of the EU's common agricultural policy. The Americans were fierce critics of the EEC back then, calling it protectionist, and not without reason. But now that has all changed. Fast forward 30, 35 years, and what do we find? In the age of America First, it's very ironic, but it's now possibly the European Union that is seen as the prime defender of free trade and the rules-based order that goes with it, on the one hand, and on the other, we have a United States which has turned mercantilist. Europe continues to believe in win-win solutions when it comes to trade. The United States appears now to have gone, at least the Trump administration, appears to have gone for win-lose. I gain, you lose. Trade wars, that sort of approach, seems to be the linchpin, the leitmotif of American trade policy today. Very ironic, a complete switch in 30, 35 years, but a very worrying one. Now here in this region, in East and Southeast Asia, I don't think I need to preach about the benefits of open trade. No other region in the world in history has gained so much, so quickly, from enhanced trade and investment. The EU itself has signed major free trade agreements with South Korea, Singapore, with Vietnam, just last month with Japan, and is negotiating others, notably here in the Philippines, where you started in 2015, and I do hope that they get back to business soon. I understand there's a real interest to do that, and I hope so, because there's a great potential here to do more. Now let me just say that while I know that these talks are far from straightforward, and they have some way to go if they're really going to have an effect, there is a real prospect that there will be an FTA between Europe and the Philippines in the next 2 or 3 years. And I very much hope that to be the case, and those of you that work on trade policy and involved with that, I hope you can do your bit as well. As I said, the partnership and cooperation agreement that we talked about yesterday opens the way to an FTA because it basically takes care of some of the more difficult political issues where we talk about it in the context of the PCA. And we have quite a, I think, a promising road ahead. But we in Europe, and I suggest you in ASEAN, we have a serious problem with Washington. As I said, it seems to be about win-lose. Whether you take the pull-out from the TPP, whether you take what's going on in their own homeland with NAFTA at the moment, and whether you take the various attacks on the multilateral system. The failure of the Americans to agree to the appointment of the judges at the WTO for trade disputes. Now, and many other things besides that. I know that they say that much of this is aimed at China, but whatever the objective of the American policy, there is fallout from this on supply chains and jobs everywhere, including, I dare say, right here in the Philippines. So we have a real issue here. Then again, I want to remind you of a few facts, going back to the nuances I spoke about earlier. And here we go back to EU-US relations in the broader picture. We should not forget the total American investment in the EU is 3 times higher than it is in all of Asia, even today. Secondly, EU investment in the United States is around 8 times the amount of total European investment in India and China put together. Thirdly, EU and US investments are the major driver still in many ways of the transatlantic relationship. They contribute to growth and literally millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And the transatlantic relationship still defines to a great extent a large part of the global economy, accounting for more than half of the trade flows. So, that relationship remains extraordinarily important. And it means that there are thousands of companies, millions of workers on both sides of the Atlantic that have a very strong interest in ensuring that commercial relations do not go off track. Sooner or later, their influence will surely be felt, we hope, in the White House, especially if, as I expect, the Trump policies result in inflation in the US heartland, where he has his famous base. In a year or two's time, a lot of his supporters will be paying a lot more for their goods in Walmart than elsewhere. And maybe they will see the folly of US policy in trade. But meantime, the storm is there and has to be weathered. We must put on our overcoats, do what we can to defend the rules-based system, and stand up for the principle of free trade. And I think the alliances that we have as Europe, here in Asia, here in the Philippines, are an important part of that. You may not agree, but I would put it to you that we have an extremely, more than ever, common interest to make sure that the system continues to function as it is. The third area I wanted to touch on was in security, and especially as regards what happens in the Middle East and what comes from the Middle East. Yet another Trump pullout. I mean, whenever you talk about the Trump administration, it's all about pullouts. It's never about opt-ins. It's all about pull out, get out, always leave, never enter. And that's another problem, because when they do this, whatever the issue, they never propose anything constructive in its place. And the big pullout that I'm mentioning here is from the Iran JCPOA, better known as the Iran nuclear deal. Now the EU, along with other signatories, especially Russia and China, continues to robustly defend this agreement as the only show in town when it comes to preventing the development of an Iranian nuclear device. But it will be very hard to keep this agreement alive, given that the secondary sanctions from the Americans will hit European companies that want to do business in Iran. And if they can't do business in Iran, they can't invest in Iran, it's highly likely that the Iranian constituencies that believe in this agreement will not be able to defend it anymore, and there could well be a return to nuclear weapons development in Iran, which will be against everybody's interest. Again, I'm well aware of the Philippines' position when it comes to nuclear proliferation. You have been one of the real leaders over the years in fighting against it, and this would be an extremely negative development, but there is a real danger that this will now happen as a result of the US pull-out. And there is a hope that the Accord can somehow survive a one-term Trump presidency. Well, I wouldn't bet on that, would you? Who knows? Anything is possible in the American system at the moment. It's very unpredictable. Certainly, if this continues for a year or two, I would expect the agreement to come under huge pressure. I don't think it can survive beyond 2020, unless the Americans change their position, which I don't think they will as long as Mr. Trump is president. And so, we have many dangers here. The one nuclear power there is, of course, in the Middle East is Israel. And the Netanyahu government wants to keep it that way. And should Iran return to nuclear power, nuclear proliferation, I should say, there is the frightening prospect of an Israeli strike. It may well happen. And just as worrying, if it goes back to the nuclear course, Iran is very likely to provoke its arch-enemy Saudi Arabia to do the same. And then it becomes a free-for-all in the Middle East. This time, not just very unpleasant terrorism, the sort that you've experienced here in the Philippines from IS and their affiliates, but this time it's big stuff, it's nuclear stuff going on. So we have a lot of dangers here, and in Europe we're acutely aware of it, and we want to do everything we can to try to preserve the Iranian agreement, but it's going to be very difficult. If that wasn't enough fuel on the Middle Eastern fire, Mr. Trump has also scotched any prospect for a meaningful return to a Middle East peace process, with his announcement that Jerusalem is now considered by the Americans as Israel's capital, without distinguishing West from East Jerusalem. That plus the unqualified support for Israeli policy. Now, the EU has made clear that we continue to support the two-state solution, however tattered it may seem, and that the US position can only be detrimental to that long-standing position. And what does that mean for this part of the world? Well, one thing you know too well in the Philippines are the consequences of violent extremism. You've been suffering from it for years, and you've had an awful experience, I know, Mindanao recently in the city of Marawi, which has been destroyed by this sort of extremism. Now, this extremism, we have it in Europe too. We have bombs in Brussels, we have bombs in Paris, we have bombs in my hometown in London, we have all over the place. So we share a common vicious experience of the consequences of this sort of extremism. In the meantime, the operations in Syria and Iraq have certainly beaten IS back, but they, along with many other extremists, remain dangerous. They are still there. They're quiet for the time being, and they have lost a lot of their capacity. But there is support for them in different parts of the world. And if the sorts of policies that you see being encouraged by the Trump administration continue, it could produce another round of violence in the Middle East. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see this, if not in Gaza, then in wider Palestine. And although the Palestinians themselves have no affinity with IS or the other extremist groups, it's a shot in the arm for extremists everywhere. If this happens, if there is another round of violence in the Middle East, and it will inspire jihadi activity everywhere. I guess it could well also affect you once again here in the Philippines at a time when you're making strides on the peace process with the passage of the Bangsamoro Organic Law and the new energy that has been brought to the peace process here. So it could be a danger for you here too. You need to keep your eye on this. But again, it's an area of fundamental disagreement between Europe and America with a lot of consequences. The last area, and by no means the least, is disagreements about liberal democratic values. Now, this is again really ironic. It was, of course, in Europe that the world's worst outbreak of anti-democratic disease ever occurred, when authoritarianism and fascism led to the Second World War. And with all due respect to Mr. Winston Churchill, the day could not have been saved without the participation of the United States. And, as I said earlier, it was the US that helped to re-establish European democracy with far-sighted programs like the Marshall Plan after 1945. And now, what have we got? We have an American president who is seemingly more at home in the company of Messrs. Putin, Xi, Kim Jong-un, Erdogan. He's more at home with them than he is with his European counterparts, his Canadian counterparts, his democratic allies around the world. The recent G7 fiasco, with its very harsh criticism of the Canadian Prime Minister, is one of only many cases in point. Now, we also see encouraging things being said to our own populist politicians in Europe, many of whom have rather dubious credentials when it comes to what we know as liberal democracy. We have European countries with real problems here. I think you know where they are and who they are. The case I know best is my own country, Britain. We have Brexit. And of course, I have to say something about Brexit to you. I'm very happy to answer your questions as best I can. But we have Brexit, where Trump has actively encouraged the anti-European campaign in Britain, and he's forged very close friendships with the leaders of that campaign. All that said, as the British people wake up to the grim prospect of international isolation, there is little evidence that Mr. Trump will follow up his warm noises with special concessions and dispensations for a post-Brexit United Kingdom, assuming that Brexit happens. And I hasten to add, it hasn't happened just yet, and if recent history is any guide, stand by for some surprises in the next few months when it comes to Brexit. But let me stop with these different points and conclude, so we can have a little bit of a Q&A. The EU-US relationship is probably at its lowest point since the formation of what is now the EU back in the early 1950s. Never have there been so many differences, whether on global issues, values, economic policy. The list is very long. Now, there are reasons to believe it's not a permanent state of affairs, and there are many people in different walks of life on both sides of the Atlantic who are working to contain the damage that's being done. And that damage, as I say, affects many other parts of the world, not least here in the Philippines, whether in terms of climate action, trade, fight against extremism. We've covered some, if not all, of the areas. There are areas where we still have agreement. For example, when it comes to the rule of law in the South China Sea, Europe and America are on the same page there. and I think not a million miles from the Philippines' position either. But overall, I'm much more worried about what we're disagreeing about than what we're agreeing about. The age of Trump may leave scars that will take a long time to heal, and I'm afraid there isn't much prospect for the moment of a healing, so long as he's there in the White House. But I thank God for the checks and balances of the US Constitution, and above all, for presidential term limits. But thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Moran, for your very insightful and candid remarks. I will now open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please approach the microphone. Kindly state your name and your office, and go. Yes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for giving insightful presentation to the Mabini Dialogue. My name is Louis. I'm a researcher at the Foreign Service Institute. I believe that the EU-US relationship is built on a very strong foundation, so with a long history, shared values, it's really going to endure despite all the low moments right now. But we are almost 2 years into the Trump presidency, and somehow we have a good grasp of his leadership style, what he believes in his worldview. So my question is, how is the European Union, or how are European countries coping or adjusting to all this to somehow at least minimize the damage to the relationship? Thank you.
Sure. So good. Yes? Go.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm Carla from the Foreign Service Institute, also a researcher. My question is, could you give some insights on the future of the alliance between U.S. and also the NATO? There have been tweets or some remarks by the President that the NATO members should contribute more on the relationship. Another issue is that during the G7 summit, President Trump mentioned that maybe you could re-include Russia in the meeting. What are your thoughts on the matter? Thank you.
One more question, please.
Let's try to respond, because these are big questions, they're good questions. So, yeah. And let me see if I can give you something to think about. On how to adjust to minimize the damage, well, there are different ways being tried. On trade, for example, you saw the President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, meeting with Donald Trump recently, where they seem to have a certain meeting of the minds, at least so far as some of the issues of tariffs are concerned. But I'm afraid that it hasn't made much difference. The American tariffs have come in, are affecting supply chains in Europe, and the European reaction is now also on the table. So we see a rise there in protectionism on the two sides of the Atlantic, which has been started by the Trump administration. How are we going to get out of this? I don't know. The Americans now, the White House has threatened to raise its game on tariffs and do more as a reaction to what the Europeans have now done. So you have a sort of a tit for tat going on, which is inevitable when you start doing things like this unilaterally, which is what the US has done. As it's done with China as well, of course, and where you're seeing a similar process going on. But it was at least encouraging that Mr. Trump met with the European Commission President to discuss these things, and we had really real worries in Europe he wouldn't do that because he doesn't really recognize the European Union as such. He's much happier dealing with country-to-country type of relationships. So that, in a sense, is one way to minimize the damage. But I'm not sure it's going to have an immediate result. I think the course, the direction of trade policy is pretty clear. Secondly, and here we get to the second question from Carla, the first question she asked, which was on NATO. I think one thing where the Trump administration probably did the right thing but said it in the wrong way, was to come to the Europeans and say that they needed to do more to pay for their own defense. And I think that's a good message. Personally, a good message to give to most, if not all, European countries. There are a couple, France and Britain, of course, who have reasonably large defense operations and budgets, but many others that do not. Certainly, when you consider that 65% of NATO assets are paid for, not just in terms of money either, but also in material, from the United States, this is an unbalanced relationship, and it does need to do something about it. The trouble is that the way in which the message was passed by Mr. Trump was not all that constructive, because he began to mix up the need for Europe to spend more money with threats that the United States may not stick by the famous Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which of course states that an attack on one is an attack on all, which really scared to death some of the smaller countries in the Baltic and elsewhere, and really didn't do much for security. In fact, it was music to the ears of those on the Russian side who want to re-establish some sort of Soviet order in that part of the world. So in other words, not the wrong message, but certainly the wrong means of conveying it. And on NATO, it's essential, it seems certainly to me and many others, that Europe does more for its own defense. And that would not only affect the situation in the transatlantic arena, but I think also may have some consequences for this part of the world, where, again, you all depend almost as much, if not as much, as Europe on American assets. You are very, very dependent on the American fleet to keep the sea lanes open, to repel what is perceived as China's ambitions in the region. We all need to do more. Europe, with its growing trade in this part of the world, has a greater interest than ever in contributing to this as well. So perhaps greater attention to defense budgets in Europe would also be a positive thing for security and the order here in East and Southeast Asia. So this could be a good thing going forward. But for the time being, the relationships in NATO are fragile. You asked also about G7 to G8. Yeah, Mr. Trump said this about re-involving the Russians in the G7 format. Well, I mean, this has not been followed up, thank God, because there's a good reason why Russia left or was asked to leave the G8, and that, of course, were their actions in Crimea and in the Ukraine, but essentially in Crimea, where they broke with international norms completely, and all the G7 immediately upped the sanctions on Russia. Whatever the rights and wrongs of what they did in Crimea, the way in which they did it was completely against the philosophy of the G7 countries. And until and unless Russia changes its policy to its near neighborhood, I think it's very unlikely that that would happen, that there will be a consensus to enlarge it back to the G8. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't all be talking to the Russians and Mr. Putin. They're extremely important. They're a big player. But in terms of readmitting them to the, let's say, the respectable club of the G7, it's not the time to do it. And I don't think anybody's in favor of it. Even in America, a lot of people in the Pentagon and elsewhere obviously were not terribly happy with Mr. Trump's statement. And since there hasn't been much follow-up, I kind of wonder whether it has that much meaning to it. We'll see. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know, Mr. Ambassador, if I can ask you this question. I'm talking about the China issue on the trade war. Well, you have been head of the China division in Brussels, so I guess it's fine for me to ask this question. Well, of course, you mentioned about the trade wars, and there are three fronts here: Europe, North America, and that of China. Now, in the part of Europe and North America, I believe it has quieted down. Although there is an apparent impasse that foretells that a favorable negotiated settlement is possible. The issue that separates the US and that of China are far deeper and larger. The big noise in the trade war is happening between the US and that of China. this is a far more serious confrontation. President Trump has threatened to cover in the tariff hit list close to 50, starting with a $50 billion tariff imposed to Chinese exports. Chinese exports to the United States. That started in July up to August of 23, August 23 of this month. But in the latest news, which I read, he's threatening to expand this to at least 500 billion US dollars of US imports to China. Now the question here is that, is the magnitude of the possible reduction of trade between the two countries significant to world economy? And, of course, how will this affect ASEAN, including the country, including the Philippines? Thank you.
Okay. Second one?
Yes.
I'm Fatima Muller from Office of Policy and Planning from DNB. I just wonder if the discord between the EU and the US would continue for the rest of the President Trump's term. What could be the impact, or how would we impact the Philippines and the rest of the ASEAN? How would we, and how could we respond if this continues? Thank you.
Okay, yes, on the trade front. 50 billion to start, as you said, 500 billion on the card. The problem here is that there are issues, serious issues with China on trade. It's no secret. We have similar issues in Europe with China. So, for example, if you take the long-standing issue of fair competition as it concerns Chinese state-owned enterprises. For a long time, we have been asking China to do something about that because it gives an unfair advantage around the world to Chinese companies. There are issues of market economy standards as defined in the WTO for China, which are related to that. There are issues of intellectual property protection, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, with China, which have been going on a long time. And there are issues related sometimes to national security as regards hacking and all the rest of it with China. So many, many trade-related issues there in the background, which need to be dealt with and need to be solved in the longer term. The question is, do you solve it by putting tariffs in the way that the Trump administration has decided? I don't think you do. You really don't get to the root of the issue, which there is a reason for these trade accounts. The other thing, which is very important to keep in mind, and here the Chinese have a point, and you have to listen to them, when they say that, okay, we may not be perfect, but there is also an issue of competitiveness of American industry. There are many industries in the States, as there are in Europe, as there are also in some parts of Asia, which are not necessarily as competitive as they should be, and the Chinese are actually better at doing it than some others. So a lot of, there's a reason for these imbalances in the trade account. If you try to solve it by firing off missiles, which is basically what you're doing when you put on tariffs, I suspect the only result will be a reduction in overall trade. A reduction in overall trade means a reduction in overall investment, means a reduction in overall global growth. In other words, a pullback on the positive effects of globalization. In other words, this is something that will, it seems to me, boomerang and make poorer not only the Chinese, but also the Americans and the rest of us as well. If it's 500 billion, as you mentioned, of course they have threatened to do this, you're looking there at a major proportion of world trade. You're looking at around about 15-20% of world trade. And that has huge knock-on effects right here in the Philippines. Philippines is in the supply chains for China, for Europe, for America. Many of your businesses depend on open trade and have been set up, and investments too have been set up on the basis that you can operate relatively freely in a relatively free trading environment. All of this will end up, it seems to me, with two main consequences: consumers will pay more for their goods, and there will be less jobs and opportunities available in all of our countries, including this one. So this is very, very dangerous. How do we solve it so long as Mr. Trump has this effect? I don't know. And one thing about Donald Trump as a person, people say he's not consistent, that he's unpredictable, that he says this, that, and the other. But when you look at Mr. Trump over the years, go back 30, 40 years, he's been saying these things about trade ever since he was a teenager. He is a fundamental mercantilist in his trade approach. And the people he has around him obviously reflect that mentality. So I'm not optimistic at all, so long as he is controlling US trade policy. It will have a negative effect on all of us for the next couple of years. Again, I go back to the US Constitution as my main savior here. For the rest, it's a question of managing it. Secondly, the second question was, will the discord continue? I fear it will. For now, I don't see things getting any better, at least not before 2020. And if indeed, as may well happen, we're looking at another term of the Trump administration until 2024, then a whole series of other challenges will occur, and it will be even more difficult. The impact on the Philippines, I think some of these examples that are coming out in the Q&A and what I said earlier shows you what the impact could be. I think the impact is a negative one. It isn't just about the EU and the US, but US policy in general is not positive, it seems to me, for the future well-being and prosperity neither of this country nor of this region. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm Ed from the Foreign Service Institute. A lot of analysts and officials and leaders seem to have a glum prognosis about the current EU-US relations right now, and reasonably so. But they say every cloud has a silver lining. I was wondering if EU sees a silver lining on the current enmity between the US and the EU right now.
One more question, please. Actually, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a question as well. Could you give us an update on how you think the FTA between the EU and the Philippines will look like? And also, could you offer you mentioned in your remarks that you were expecting some surprises on Brexit. Could you clarify what you think those surprises will be?
Right. Thank you for that question about a silver lining. I'm an optimist. Like most people here in this country. One of the nice things about the Philippines is that you have a lot of smiling faces. I know that you have a lot of problems, and you have a lot of challenges, but it's good that you meet a lot of optimists here, and it's always good to be here. Is there a silver lining? Then maybe some people argue that, for example, I pointed earlier to the issues around European defense, that Mr. Trump's disruption vis-à-vis his approach to NATO would strengthen European solidarity to do more for itself, to defend itself, and therefore deepen European integration. It's possible. Also, more generally, with the feeling in Europe that, not just in defense, but elsewhere, that we cannot depend anymore on Uncle Sam to bail us out in whatever area it might be, that we become more autonomous and more self-sufficient, and a mentality of stronger European feeling is created as a result. It's possible. But I think you also have to look at the costs in the meantime, because these actions by the US have real negative consequences. So I'm not sure. If there is a silver lining, it might be that, but I wouldn't want to emphasize it too much. I personally would be much happier if we had a constructive relationship with the Americans, and one which is more in the nature of traditional solidarity, especially at a time when the world is having to face up to many, many challenges to the international order, the rules-based order that we've known since the Second World War. It is very fragile. And it's being challenged from other places, notably from Moscow. China is committed, yes, in some ways, but in some ways not. And China itself, I think, doesn't know, as it develops so quickly and grows so quickly, doesn't really know whether or not 10 years from now it will still be a believer in the WTO and everything else that goes with it. I think China's a little bit confused at the moment about its position, and I wouldn't depend entirely on the Chinese to be defending the order in the years ahead. But that order, we should never forget what it's given us. It has hauled close to 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 30, 40 years. Yes, the income has not been well distributed, and yes, we have many, many problems as a result, including here in the Philippines. But without it, would this have been possible? I don't think so. I think there'd be a lot more poverty, a lot more misery in the world without it. And it is under enormous pressure. So, in order for that order to survive and prosper, you need a constructive European-American relationship, amongst other things. And at the moment, you don't really have it. So I'm more worried about that. But yes, silver linings we should always look for, I agree. On the FTA, you know that I'm not, in fact, involved in the detail of this. You might do well if I suggest, hopefully soon there'll be some visitors from Brussels for a round of negotiations on the FTA. And I would suggest that those of you interested in trade policy, if you can somehow convince them to come and talk to you, to give you some of the detail on this, it might be a useful thing. Although I must say that my experience of trade negotiators is that they don't like talking to audiences like this. They prefer to keep it quiet until they've agreed their different issues. But sometimes it can be very useful, particularly if you're talking to business constituencies in the rest. I mean, they had 2 rounds of negotiations. I think there was quite a, as I understand it, quite a lot of agreement on a number of key trade technical issues. There has been a problem on human rights, in the sense that some of the actions that have been taken here in the Philippines have been interpreted by the European Parliament in a certain way. I'm sure you're aware there have been a few resolutions criticizing the country, which was taken, I think, rather badly by your president and others, and there's been some conflict about that. But at the same time, the underlying economic interest in opening up trade between the EU and the Philippines remains. And there is a business constituency here, and there is a business constituency in Europe. Current trade, I think, is around about 13, 14 billion euros, which has been growing fast, but it could be doubled very quickly if we had an FTA. As we've seen with EU-South Korea, where trade has doubled in 5 years, as we are already seeing with EU-Japan, which is not yet in force, but is signed, and already the investments and the trade is increasing, as we're seeing also with Singapore and with Vietnam. No reason why it should not happen here in the Philippines, given the potential. Anyway, the 3rd round is yet to be decided. I know there is interest in the Philippines to start it. I hope very much that the Brussels administration, the Commission, the European Commission, will respond positively. With any luck, maybe by the end of the year we see a 3rd round. Now the average, these things are not done overnight. Free trade agreements with the EU generally take 4 to 5 years to complete. And the negotiations were opened at the end of 2015. If the Philippines and the EU are, at least initially, if not signing finally a ratified agreement by 2020, that would be a good result. So I'm quite optimistic about that. I think there is a path forward for the FTA. And apart from the business interest, of course, it also helps the political relationship between the Philippines and Europe to become closer and more meaningful. On your question on Brexit, well, when I say surprises, I don't know. Britain is a country which has a reputation for continuity, traditional politics, party politics, and so forth. Not too much unpredictability until 2016 with the EU referendum. That, I think, was the general impression of the country. Since that referendum, it's become extremely unpredictable. I know in the Philippines sometimes you say that you have your ups and downs with the changes of your administrations and presidents, but it's nothing as compared to what we're currently experiencing in the UK. Now, the state of the Brexit negotiations are essentially that under the treaty, it should be by March next year that the UK would actually leave the European Union. And at the moment, It's not yet agreed finally, but there will be a 2-year transition period after that. Now, the negotiations with the European Commission, which represents all of the other member states, have come to a bit of a deadlock over a couple of major issues. We don't have time to get into the detail today. But I think there's going to be, by the end of October, on the table, either there will be no agreement, or there will be some sort of rather weak agreement based on the proposals that came from the British Prime Minister about a month ago. And that then has to go to the British Parliament to be voted on. Now, the question then becomes, is there a majority in the British Parliament for either no deal or some deal? And at the moment, there is no majority, given the construct of the British Parliament and the party political position. One of the possibilities, and it remains only a possibility, is that with Parliament deadlocked and unable to take a decision, it may go back to a second referendum, based on whatever deal is on the table. There is a growing strain of opinion in the United Kingdom that says, well, we voted to leave, but we didn't know where we were leaving to. Now we sort of know, or we should know in a couple of months where we're going. And we need to vote again, because now we don't speculate anymore, we actually know what the destination will be. Well, I'm not sure they will, but nevertheless, that's the kind of argument that is coming along. And there is a growing support, there is now a majority support, according to all of the reliable polls, insofar as polls are reliable, for a second vote on leaving or staying in the European Union. There are many precedents for this. We've had second referendums in many European countries before. We had them in France, we had them in Ireland, we had them in the Netherlands, and we had them somewhere else. Maybe Eric Bullock will remember, I can't remember, but at least 3 or 4 countries where on European issues there have been second referendum. On the other hand, if you go for a second vote, of course, you don't necessarily solve the problem of the people in the UK that feel that the country should not be part of Europe. And you may have a lot of dispute, and some people talk about demonstrations and violence in the streets and heaven knows what else. But I'm saying it's a possibility, and it's a growing possibility. So you could have no deal, you could have some deal, you could have a second vote. Any one of these things could happen in the next 2 or 3 months. The important thing is to remind that Brexit hasn't yet happened. And it may not yet happen. I think the possibilities of a change are there, but it remains nothing more than a possibility, and we shall have to see. But I'm sorry to bore everybody with the Brexit story, but you asked the question, so there you are. Anyway, expect surprises. That's the only thing I can say.
Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't see, and thank you for visiting us. Given all this unpredictability, and since we're in the Foreign Service Institute, we're tasked to train our junior diplomats, I'd like to know what are the main skills or values that this future diplomat should have, and should we work on as we approach the unpredictability in the future. Thank you, sir.
Yes, I know it's a big challenge in diplomatic academies everywhere to modernize your services. We face similar challenges in Europe and around the world. Well, the traditional skills of diplomacy, I think, will always remain an important part of whatever you do. Languages, obviously being one, engagement being another, negotiation skills, of course, all of the traditional skills of a diplomat will remain important. The day when they're not important is the day when you were at war. Never forget that. So that is there too. But of course, these days, you also have a whole series of areas, some of them economic, trade policy, for example, where it's moving very, very quickly. Others related to security and technology, like cybersecurity, where you need expertise in your diplomatic services if you're going to be effective. I think it puts an enormous strain on institutes like this one to try to keep astride of all of that. But I do think you don't necessarily need a completely reconstructed type of diplomat, but you do need even a broader range of skills than you have had in the past. And I think you need to be a little bit more specialized, perhaps, than was the case previously. There is a general feeling in diplomacy, I know in many countries, including in Europe, that you can be what used to be called a gifted amateur, a generalist who can turn his or her hand to anything. Such people are always very rare, and they're even rarer than ever these days. So I think one has to recognize that certain specialities are needed. And I think also you need to understand that the importance of expertise, let's say, on climate change in the diplomatic context is at least as important as the traditional skills more related to matters like security, policy, and the rest. I think there is a danger that diplomacy becomes irrelevant if it stays too rooted in its traditional skills set. I'm sure you're aware of all of these things, but it puts enormous challenges on the table for institutes like yours to try to keep your diplomatic service up to speed and relevant to today. We've had, I think, in Europe, an interesting experience because, on the one hand, the European member states, diplomats, of course, with many of whom have histories running back, my God, 500 or 600 years. I think the first ambassador in modern times was sent out in the 14th century to the Vatican, if I'm not mistaken, from, is it from Madrid, from Paris, I can't remember where. So it's a long, long, long tradition. And one of the things that has changed the face of European diplomacy in the last 30 years has been European countries' involvement with the European institutions. European institutions are not sovereign states, but they have mandated sovereignty in certain areas, like, for example, in trade policy, to a lesser extent in development policy, but nevertheless, these have been areas where the member states' diplomats have had to come up to speed if they're going to understand, because the member states play a role in the administration, of course, of the European Union, if they're going to understand properly the policies of the European Union and participate fully in them. And that, in turn, has changed a little bit the mentality of many of our member state diplomatic services. And I think it's important, it's an important thing. But that sort of thing, a broader skill set, modernizing diplomatic services with these things, and perhaps above all, giving the same status to these skills as you give to the traditional skills of a diplomatic service is very important. And good luck.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Crispin from the Office of Resident Visiting Forces. My question is, in 2016, the European Union, through the European External Action Service, released the Global Strategy of the European Union, emphasizing on the European Union as a global actor. The actorness of the European Union and its institutional competencies, looking into, let's say, union solidarity and among others, is favorable for the European Union in terms of its negotiation and establishing a so-called framework for partnership and cooperation. How can this strategy, looking into more a strategic level, policy level mindset, how can this strategy help lessen or remove, or at least trying to veer away from the disagreement between the policy areas or portfolios that the European Union have, let's say the environment or trade, commerce, among others, in terms of establishing deeper relationship with the United States?
One more question, yes?
I may be allowed to ask a second question. But with Trump pulling out of international agreements and the perceptions that the U.S. is retreating from its global leadership, my question is, how much can we expect from the European Union in filling in some of this void? How willing, how ready, and how able is the EU to take more more active role, not only in specific issues like terrorism and climate change, but even in other security issues like maritime security and overall preservation of the liberal order? Thank you.
Okay, well, the two questions are to some extent related. I think you mentioned the global strategy and the US. One thing about the global strategy is that it was essentially written before the election of Donald Trump. So when you read that strategy, it sort of took for granted traditional American positions on a number of issues, whether related to security or to economy and so on. It was issued in June, if I'm not mistaken, 2016, 6 months before the American presidential election. Come the American presidential election, and to some extent the strategy became in need of an update. But we're not about to do an update, I think, in the global strategy. The basic concept behind it, of course, relies on the notion of strengthening external security in the interest of European internal security, and doing that through the notion of resilience. And I'm sure you had many discussions about what resilience means when it comes to foreign policy and the rest. I'm not going to pretend to know that I know what it means. It's a very broad term. But those concepts essentially remain. And so, with or without the US, the concentration that we have remains doing whatever we can to strengthen external security in our own best interest. So if you like, it's on the old time-honored principle of enlightened self-interest that the global strategy hangs as an effective approach. It is true, with the American position, it's become much, much more difficult to achieve some of the objectives within it, but the principles remain. And, I mean, for example, it informs a little bit what the EU does here in the Philippines. If you look at the concentration of activity by the EU in this country, the development policy here, for example, is a very important adjunct to the peace process in Mindanao. Do we assist the peace process in Mindanao just to be the good guys, to cooperate with you for the best interests of international affairs and so on? Yes, we do, but we also do it because what happens in Mindanao can sometimes come back and sting you in your own homeland. The relationships between violent extremists are now global, no doubt about that. I'm not saying that we would be worried about hundreds or thousands of Filipino-based jihadis coming to Europe to blow up our metro stations or our airports. Nevertheless, violent extremism knows no borders, and wherever it occurs, it's important to do all you can to fight it. So there is a concentration here on EU activity of assisting wherever we can the peace process in Mindanao, and also doing whatever we can, whether it be as European Union or indeed individual European countries, to help on the security side. Now, this leads to the second question about can the EU fill the gap in security issues that is being left by the Americans? Well, the Americans are still there, thank God, in large parts of the world. They're still engaged. It hasn't yet, I think, caused massive pullouts. But there are worries about it, there's no doubt at all. Especially in the Mediterranean and some other areas, Middle East, where you see much less American engagement than was the case in the past. There are worries that the pullback will continue. Can the EU fill the gap? In its current condition, frankly, no. The EU cannot fill the gap. Why do I say that? Well, it relates a little bit earlier to European expenditures on defense, which are wanting, and something has to be done about that, whether it's in the context of NATO or whether it's in the context of European Union measures. And of course, we do have some. We have something called PESCO, which is a new type of defense cooperation, which is has some potential to do this. No, we cannot fill the gap. Not within the short or medium term. Long term, perhaps, but that will take a generation. There's no European army on the horizon, and I don't think that's a prospect meaningfully. You don't get armies unless you have states. The European Union is not a state. It's an association of states. Yes, indeed, with sovereignty as European Union. It's a unique organization. Nevertheless, we're nowhere near having a polity which is sufficiently integrated to say that there will be a European army. But we do have very close cooperation. Let me give you one example where it makes a difference, which I know well, which is in the Gulf of Aden, in the fight against piracy. And also now, in terms of the dangers to international shipping, which is coming from the conflict in Yemen, in the Red Sea. That is Operation Atalanta. This is a naval operation which involves at least 7 of the European member states and the European institutions working together for the last 6 years, together with other neighbors, with the Americans, with the Chinese, with the Indians, but Europe as one entity, to fight off piracy in that part of the world, and indeed to secure the sea lanes. And it's made a big difference. ASEAN too, by the way. The Indonesians have not sent ships, they've certainly sent some of their people. And one would hope also the Philippines, which has an interest in this too. To some extent, it is an example of what you can do under current circumstances. But it's nowhere near filling the gap that you're referring to. The Americans remain far and away the most important security entity in the world. And for the time being, I'm afraid it's irreplaceable. And under these conditions, if this continuing disengagement occurs, I think we should be very worried over the next 5, 10 years. After that, who knows? Maybe things will change, maybe the EU, maybe ASEAN too, will integrate to the point where it can provide and take up a significant amount of the strain, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Any more questions? Yes?
Good afternoon, ambassadors. Nice to see you again. I'm Sheila from the DFA. My question is about, you mentioned the policy of the U.S. is more on a win-lose policy, and I was wondering if it's actually a winning policy. Is the U.S. really winning in the Trump administration policy in the short term or even in the medium term? And also, are there other actors that are winning aside from the U.S. in this policy? Another question would be on Turkey. As you know, the U.S. and Turkey have kind of a love-hate relationship. Mr. Trump has had a very negative policy right now on Turkey. And how do you think this will affect EU-U.S. relationship? And that's it. Thank you.
Okay. So we probably have time for one more question, and that'll be the last one. Yes?
Good afternoon, Ambassador Moran. I'm from the Office of European Affairs. We thank you for your participation yesterday in the PCA conference. I actually missed it because I was here. I had to be here. But I thank the Foreign Service Institute for organizing this this lecture. On my question, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to the question raised earlier. If the EU, you mentioned earlier, the EU couldn't fill the role of the US. The U.S. is retreating right now, will China be able to fill the gap? Because China has always been saying that, for example, in terms of trade, in terms of climate change, it's now taking a leadership role in terms of trade, climate change, because it continues to stay committed to all these international displayed by the book. Thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent question, and a good one to finish on. So I think to take the first one, on the question of win-lose, frankly speaking, in the short term and in the medium term, there may be some very restricted winners. So, for example, the coal mines of West Virginia, which I mentioned earlier, which I think now employ, is it 20,000? They used to employ about 200,000 people. 20,000 coal miners of West Virginia will benefit from the tariffs that have been slapped on steel, aluminum, and so on, and coal and steel. As against that, 20 million consumers in America will pay more money because of the tariffs, because tariffs is nothing more than a tax. They will lose. They will become less prosperous as a result. So in the short term, the overwhelming equation will be that you will lose. In the longer term, if the tariffs continue, you will shut down trade altogether, and you will lose investment, which means jobs also go. And there'll be even more losses. I have absolutely no doubt about it that short, medium term economically will lose. And more significantly perhaps than that, there are elements in this world who really don't get it when it comes to open and free trade. Let's have a look, for example, at Russian trade policy. Out of the Russian Sea trade, I think it's clear, as far as they're concerned, since they have a completely undiversified economy that depends entirely on oil, gas, and arms exports, they're not very interested in the wider trade picture. They also feel that the so-called international order, rules-based system, is something of a conspiracy set up by the Americans and the Europeans and some Asians and even China to some extent, which would be very, very happy to see eroded and brought down. Well, I don't think that's very constructive. I think they could be a winner of what is happening under Mr. Trump. If trade wars continue, we're talking $500 billion worth of goods subject to tariffs. This gets very, very serious. So that makes people who feel that way in Russia, and a few other countries too, perhaps, happy, but it should also make us very worried. In Turkey, very complicated relationship that we all have with Turkey at the moment. The negative relationship that Turkey has with America, of course, on the surface is about the imprisonment of the American pastor, but underlying that, there is a real worry from the Erdogan administration that what the Americans have been doing in Syria has just strengthened the Kurdish groups there. And that, of course, is for Turkey an existential issue. On the other hand, if you're serious about fighting Islamic State, you had to have alliances with the Kurds, who did most of the fighting, quite frankly, to pare back the terrorists there. So this is a very difficult area. And as regards Turkey's relationship with Europe as well, we have a lot of issues, a lot of problems. But we need each other badly, not least for our respective prosperity, but also because of our migration crisis in Europe. Without Turkey, it's very hard to manage it. So you're looking at a very complicated series of issues here. You're also looking at a NATO member state, a common NATO member state, as with most European countries and indeed with the United States. So at the moment it's very worrying. I think if they can find a way around the issue of the pastor, that will help. They have the Gulen issue. You follow Turkey, obviously. I know it's complicated, but if they can find a way around the pastor issue, perhaps it will restore a little bit of stability. But it's very fragile at the moment, and will remain so, primarily because of what's been happening in the area in Syria. And until we find a way forward on stability in Syria, to the satisfaction of everybody, we're going to continue to see negative fallout from that relationship with Turkey. Then the final question, the very good question, can China somehow fill that gap of left behind by American disengagement? Well, I doubt it very much, for a number of reasons. Now, you have to distinguish here China in your region from China globally. There are those, and many in Europe as well, who believe that China, a superpower in the making, has designs on global domination. I don't think that's the case. I've dealt with China for 20 years. It's true if you want to take the old communist conspiracy theory, and indeed the old Internationale of pure Marxist thought and the rest, Leninist thought and the rest, that you might have reasons to be suspicious of China. But I don't look upon China as a communist country. It has a communist party, yes, but it's not a communist country. And I don't think it has in its bones the desire to be dominant globally. However, regionally, of course, it's another story. And here, right here in the Philippines, you're on the front line with Chinese expansion. And I think you have a very, very delicate, difficult issue to deal with. You as diplomats, many of you here, probably is one of your greatest challenges, dealing with China, especially on the South China Sea and everything associated with that. We also in Europe, as I said earlier, have strong interests as well, especially when it comes to the sea lanes, keeping trade, operating properly, avoiding conflict here. So this is an extremely difficult one. Now, the way the US has been handling the Pax Americana in the Pacific since the Second World War, the way the US has handled it is not perfect, but on the whole, with maybe the exception of the last period, it has been relatively successful. It's been an important part of the success of globalization, which is to say that the American security umbrella has been there for generally positive developments in world trade, and especially here in East Asia, Southeast Asia. To imagine the Chinese would handle it in quite the same way is a stretch. And I'm not sure the Chinese would know how to do it in the same way, because China looks at it very nationalistic, inside out. America is also nationalistic, but there is a very strong outside-in mentality, even now, Mr. Trump notwithstanding, in the US, and certainly in the way that it handles its military relationships around the world. So the short answer, I don't think China can fill the gap that could be there. Let's hope the gap will not be there, but could be left in the longer term by the US. But on the other hand, it's going to be a much more important player when it comes to maritime security in particular, but not just maritime security, in the next 10 years. And we're going to have to, all of us, learn how to manage that and accommodate it in a peaceful way that avoids conflict. Back to diplomacy. Back to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. That concludes our forum for this afternoon. Allow me to wrap up our proceedings. In his remarks, Ambassador Moran discussed the state of the relationship between the EU and the US. He talked about how the relationship is currently at its lowest point in history due to the unilateral actions of one side. He also talked about some of the notable trends in recent years, including the erosion of free trade, the collapse of the rules-based international order, the fracturing of military alliances, and the rise of populism in a liberal democracy all over the world. In the Q&A, he also gave his thoughts on a wide range of issues, including US trade policy and its global impact, and he offered his assessment of how he believes things will play out going forward.